Hi, everyone.
Hello.
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 So, excellent. That worked. We're live on YouTube as well as on Twitch. Hooray!
The future.
We're living in the future, or not, as the case may be. So welcome to this week's Saturday live stream, where we are going to discuss sources of inspiration. How are we going to get started? Well, I would like you all to cast your mind back to the 1980s.
Oh.
Reagan and Gorbachev are vying for the love of Margaret Thatcher. The miners are striking. My milk has been stolen. And Graham is beavering away on a classic campaign that in the future will be known as the greatest of all role-playing campaigns.
Wow.
Feel the weight.
Until ours is published. Yeah. Graham, where did you find your inspiration from?
Well,
good Lord.
Yeah, a lot of the Enemy Within campaign, I mean, it was very collaborative, me, Jim, and Phil. But specifically, this is a story I tell a lot about Shadows over Bogenhafen and where that came from. And at the time, Warhammer didn't really know what it was or what it was going to be. The Warhammer world was very vague and nebulous and very D&D-ish in many ways. But I knew there would be chaos. So I thought, okay, let's do something involving a demon. And this was sort of the start of Warhammer's kind of yes, but approach to design. Because I thought, okay, demon, someone's selling their soul. Let's rip off Faust. And he sells his soul. He gets 7 years of service out of the demon, but then his soul is forfeit. Yes, but would anyone in their right mind ever make a deal like that? No, there's got to be some kind of let-out clause. And from that came, spoilers, from that came the idea of the cult that he was a head of, that he was going to sacrifice all their members to get out and pay off his own soul debt. But they thought they were using sorcery to get rich because, hey, it was the 80s and yuppies and stuff like that. And yes, but demons are centuries and millennia old, whereas humans, you know, in a medieval setting, are lucky if they reach 40. So this demon is going to have seen it all before. He's going to be a lot smarter and wilier. So he's foreseen that. And in any case, it doesn't matter because it's all a means to his end. And the sacrifice will actually open a chaos gate in the heart of the empire and get him lots and lots of points with his boss, Tzeentch.
Which is exactly what happened when I played the Shadows over Bogenhaven.
Yep, happens to a lot of people. So, yeah, you could say that the inspiration for Shadows over Bogenhafen was started with Faust, but there was a lot of yes, but about it. And one of the sort of precepts that developed with Warhammer was, yeah, let's set up a heroic situation. Yes, but things are going to go wrong. And,
undermining certain stereotypes that often come with the genre.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you showed us a fantasy stereotype and we were right in there with our post-punk sensibilities trying to subvert it and send it up and generally make it look silly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're so spoiled now with all the culture that we can consume that I probably would have died to watch in the 80s. Like all I had was Thundercats and He-Man.
That tells a whole bunch right there, frankly.
Yeah, and She-Ra. Don't forget She-Ra. And you can tell a lot about me from that. But do you think it was less rich then, and so you had to go to other places? Do you think it's easier now to find that inspiration?
I think so. I mean, back in the 80s and the later 70s, there weren't fantasy movies really to speak of. I mean, there was Hawk the Slayer.
I was just going to say Hawk. Don't forget Hawk the Slayer.
Yeah, that was and then Kroll.
Master.
Yeah. But the fact that we can
Sword and the Sorcerer.
Lady Hawk.
Yeah.
Oh,
Lonely
excellent.
Hawk was probably one of the better ones, but I mean, that's less than one hand.
No,
that we
that's
can
true.
Think of off the top of our heads.
We were starved.
Fantasy literature was in its infancy. It was all mixed in with the science fiction on the shelves. You got Moorcock and Tolkien and maybe a couple of Howard reprints, and you were lucky if you found anything else. And then a lot of fantasy started coming out, cashing in on Dungeons and Dragons, but most of it was really, really bad.
It's not fair.
And so for my part, I turned to horror, particularly classic old-fashioned horror like your Bram Stokers and your Sheridan Le Fanu's and what have you. Those books that had informed the Hammer films of my youth, really. So that sort of not direct sources of inspiration, but probably informed a general approach which came out in Warhammer, and that there was a lot of horror there. But perhaps the strangest source of inspiration I ever used was Deep Purple. And, well, it all started with Rainbow, of course, the Deep Purple spin-off band that used a lot of sword and sorcery imagery. And
Ronnie James Dio was always going to be throwing that around, isn't he?
Well, he was indeed. And sometime in my student days, under the influence of far too much Theakston's XB at low student prices, I put together an entire dungeon that was themed around Rainbow and Deep Purple songs. And yes, the Black Knight was a long way from home. But funnily enough, that sort of got developed and morphed and everything, and actually saw print as an adventure called Find the Lady in a magazine called GM Publications, immediately before I joined Games Workshop. And that was the last D&D adventure I wrote before Warhammer. And people have always said, those few who have read it have always said it had a kind of a Warhammer feel. So there's that.
Smiling Tom says about Shadows over Bogenhafen, to be honest, I just wanted my players to fail that bit just to watch it all unravel. It's probably not uncommon.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I've run that adventure now around about 20 times, and I've only had it go bad twice. And it's always been a deep sense of failure within me because of that. Because when it goes wrong, it's just so much fun. When I was doing the new version and I was discussing a lot of the art, I think one of the funnest little details in that whole book is when Tzeentch arrives at the end, the Greater Demon of Tzeentch, as we turned it to with the most recent edition, and there is a tiny little troll slayer attached to the bottom of this demon, which is several hundreds of feet tall. And there's just this tiny little troll slayer hanging on with his axe going, "I'll have you! I'll have you!" Where he's smaller than one of its tiniest little flecks of scales on the side of its hide. And it's those little details that keep you sane when you're going through the last minutiae of layout. But yeah, it was a fun little extra, because if you're going to have a big, massive, enormous cataclysmic adventure as well, to try and make sure that it goes with the bag, but only twice.
Sultana says to my comment about pop culture these days, we've got access to many sources, but Smiling Tom has replied, yes, but at the same time that makes it harder to surprise the players. Do you think that's true?
I do. I think you can't rip things off straight and just drop them into a campaign.
I mean, I have. For my personal campaigns, I totally have. I ripped off Mass Effect once, as Lindsay mentioned in a previous stream, and I just totally ripped it off. She hadn't played the game. It was a really easy way to test a set of rules that I was doing, and then she played the game and went, "Oh, holy heck, you just stole this, didn't you?" And I just went, "Yeah."
I think if you repackage things, you can kind of keep them fresh. There's sometimes a moment where, towards the end of a campaign, where I might realize what Andy's source of inspiration is, and be like, "Oh, I see what we're in." Right? Okay.
Yeah. I think that's because now you don't have to hunt for those sources of inspiration like
that's true.
Would previously. It's all everybody's sort of so conscious and has absorbed so much of it. There's the very real risk of you, as GMing an adventure where the players quickly pick up on where you've taken those those little hints from, and then I suppose it's down to them whether they want to play along or whether they want to actively subvert the narrative that is so clearly directing them along.
That's exactly it. If I set up an expectation, then I have to subvert it. I have to, do the bait and switch, get people going the wrong way. And
I think that's
just me.
When we were discussing the update of the Enemy Within and all the things that we could do, a great deal of discussions Graham and I had were on how can we best look at this and take their expectations, subvert them, and also make very interesting, compelling stories that aren't just about subverting expectations, because that's
right.
Not cool. It's all about ensuring that you build a story that is both what they expect and completely isn't what they expect, and that sometimes means not subverting expectations.
That's true. Yeah.
Because there's such an expectation of a particular event happening that when it doesn't, it completely blindsides you, and then something else happens, and that's what keeps things interesting. I'd say from our perspectives as well, we're somewhat unique in the role-playing community in terms of the games that we play, but also the games that we make. In that, as I say, I have ripped off all manner of stuff for my personal games, but when it comes to our professional material, we obviously can't do that. I mean, we can be influenced by, that's slightly different to rip-offs. Stuff that we read and enjoy, the media we consume, influencing what we then create for our own stuff. But that's quite different to just taking Mass Effect and slapping it in the 40k realm. Let's go and test out a game. You can do something quite different at your home games where you can just steal wholesale and slot in. Which means that when it comes to influences that we have for our own material, you tend to find that when it moves away from your personal games, it starts to get so much broader. The things that you are drawing from that will inspire your work. So it'll be far more than just that book you read, that movie you watched, that song that you listened to, Deep Purple. We'd start moving beyond that to the bizarre dreams that we might have had. And how that influences our work, or what happened when we were out in a walk and we saw a particular building at a particular angle, or we saw a sign was cut off and it says Gravesend because you can't see the whole thing, and you're like, oh, Gravesend, that could be a story. And suddenly things come upon us as we're moving around. And one of the, I find from my perspective as a creator, one of the things that I regret most is not having a bloody notebook with me or taking my phone with me, because constantly there's things around me that make me go, oh, I could do this, that, and the other, and I idiotically don't note it down for later. But yes.
I do want to ask Mark a question. So, Mark, when I think of iconic Games Workshop art, two spring to mind. One, because Andy has it on a t-shirt and wears it all the time still, the Dark Angels Interrogator Chaplain, and two, Morathy, who is a particular favorite of mine. And they really, they stick in my mind. That's your part of a much bigger contribution you made. So I've always been curious as to how much that was written and you drew them, and how much you drew them and then they were written. So how much does the inspiration come to you from writers, and how much is the reverse true?
It's a real mix. It depends very much on the piece. I mean, those two examples, the Dark Angel, that's, I mean, you get a certain degree of freedom back in the day as the Space Marines were being kind of redefined, I think, for that sort of second edition. So it was like, oh, the Dark Angel, so they'll be robed and stuff. But then you get to noodle on the detail. But then you're also working from the concept art and the miniatures, people like Jez Goodwin, which are always so beautifully rendered. In contrast, Morathy and the Dark Elf stuff was kind of, well, they're just like spiky elves. That's pretty much all we have at the moment. So, go crazy. So she was. I mean, I did a couple of versions of her. One for the 5th edition Warhammer Armies book, I think, and then I did a color piece for Black Library, which I've since come to describe as Morathy the Vegas years, because she's got all these big feathers. She looks like she's a showgirl. She looks like she's on stage somewhere, the big feathers and all that kind of.
That's the one that Lindsay
craziness.
Is that the one? Oh, okay. That's the one that I still have a copy of in my 1995 or 1996 pristine Games Workshop calendar. I've got 2 copies.
Wow.
Yeah. So sad.
The things we keep.
I know.
Yeah, so in some instances you get sort of a complete sort of free reign to dive in there, but there's always, certainly something like with Warhammer, even when it was new armies or new sort of subsets, new examinations of the wider Warhammer universe, something like Necromunda. There's always a kind of a framework and a style and an expectation that you're playing within. But oftentimes it'd be like, well, we need some special characters for this race. Away you go.
I have modelled myself on an Escher Juve. It is known.
Excellent.
That actually relates to a question I'd like to ask Mark, actually, as well, if that's all right.
Oh, exciting.
So, well, just obviously for some of the work you've been doing for us, like for instance, the portraits you did of us, you obviously got us to kind of pose in particular ways to give you a kind of a source of inspiration. And obviously you've shared with us some photos of you doing similar stuff for some of our other works of art as well. And I just wondered, like, how often do you do that as part of your process? Do you often find it useful to either have yourself or somebody to give you a kind of a reference shape? Or?
Yeah, that's actually become a thing I've only done in recent years. I never used to shoot reference photos. But I started doing it when I made Dark Deeds with Andy Chambers and Ryan Miller about 5 years ago, because the game, it's a card game, and there's lots of portraits, little sort of head and shoulder portraits, and because you've not got a lot of real estate on a playing card to convey character, it was really important that I got the poses and the facial expressions really, really interesting, and I just started taking photographs of myself. Because I was having to cram so much character in there. I thought, well, I'll shoot some reference because that'll be kind of useful for sort of maybe some sort of subtlety of gesture that I wouldn't necessarily get right if I was just drawing it from my head. And what I discovered is that I'm actually a far better model than I am an artist. Because I found that I was, like, the photographs when I looked at the photographs I took of myself, I was always finding them far better as sources of inspiration than anything I was drawing. So I became more and more reliant on it. And some would say too reliant on it. Some people say you keep drawing yourself, and it's true. I do. I need to consciously now change the features, because people say, oh, I can see, like, people who know me say, oh, I've seen you pull that face many times. But I found now it's like, anytime I'm doing stuff, I'll immediately get the camera out, and I've got a little remote control thingy on it. So I'll throw bits of costume on and strike a pose and take a few pictures and go, oh yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. And I find that I pull far better faces myself than I would do if I was just drawing it out the top of my head. I usually start with a thumbnail sketch, it must be said, just to get costume ideas together, and then I'll go, right, that's the sketch. Now let's try and sort of recreate it, and I'll end up being far more animated in my reference photos than I would possibly be otherwise. So I rely on it an awful lot these days.
There's a nice comment down there. As an illustrator, I could listen to Mark all day talk art. Right, this was a pre-submitted question from the but there was a follow-up, so I'm just going to get it. So Joe Smoke asked, to what degree do you find randomization a source of information? And they say, to clarify a bit, I find some constraints useful in sparking my creativity. So when I was writing one-shots regularly, I would often quickly throw up a quick list of possible flavors of antagonist and then roll to determine which one I was going to develop. That sounds like an exercise Andy Leask would set his first years in English.
Funny you say that. I do literally have. I genuinely use a dice randomizer for like story elements to get kids starting to write creative writing. So like we get a selection of locations and occupations and a characteristic and a prop. And they like randomly pick one of each, and then have to make a story out of it. So like we model it once together, and then then they can have a go themselves. And it's very useful because it does, sometimes inspiration seems to just strike from all the myriad things you've had before without a conscious thought. Something wonderful just flows out of you, and you're like, bang! I've got a brilliant idea. Yeah. but often you sit and you look at, I talk about to my kids, I talk about the tyranny of the blank page, and how they sit there and they know they have to write something and they can't. And the school I teach in is a slightly odd one in that, in many ways, in a good way, mostly. But in the let's not get ourselves fired live on the stream. But in the oldest years, we use the Scottish qualifications. So creative writing is a portfolio, so students get to think about it, plan it, get some feedback on the plan, do a draft, get feedback on the draft, finish it, and submit it off to the SQA. In our sort of middle years, we're currently doing GCSE, in which creative writing is done in the exam under exam conditions, which I hate. I think is abhorrent. Writers don't write like that. The idea that you can, in 45 minutes, craft a complete story from nowhere and have it finish off well, it's an awful thing to ask 14, 15-year-olds to do. So we have to spend a lot of time drilling them to how to very quickly come up with the shape of a story, which is a useful discipline, but it also kind of leads to things becoming a little bit formulaic, a little bit stale. And it means for students that struggle, perhaps, that don't enjoy writing, many of them do, and they love it, they have no problem with it at all. But the ones who don't enjoy writing, they just sit and stare at the blank page and they panic and they write something terrible and it ends with, it was all a dream, or they just end on like a poorly conceived cliffhanger because they've literally just run out of time. And so, yeah, giving them the framework of a randomizer like that can be very, very useful to kind of teach them that kind of discipline of just practicing the skill of going, well, okay, I've got these things. What's the conflict here? What's the thing that's going to incite some action? What's the climax we're building to? And is it going to end with like a kind of resolution of that climax, or is it going to end with an anti-climax instead? And if they basically follow that kind of simple algorithmic process, they can make a solid enough story in time. So
I think Andy Law, you wanted to come in and say something.
I've got two relatively short things to say. The first one is randomized pieces for your GM to pick up ideas are great. Because of everything Andy just said. So I'm just going to underline that and say that's my opinion. I think they are, in fact.
Yeah. I think, yeah. Sorry, you've got another one. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. My second point, though, is completely left field. When I was working on the Massive Nyarlathotep, and I had 75 maps, I think I had to do, or something ridiculous like that, and around about 50 handouts to do. It was an enormous amount of work. My brain fried. And in a similar fashion to sitting in front of that blank screen, I was sitting in front of a blank canvas, so to speak, with a need to come up with different ways to map. But because it had to be tonally consistent all the way through, I had to work through it. It did, however, have a completely different effect on the maps I did right after, because I was doing another map for a Call of Cthulhu campaign, the Abominations of Peterson's Abominations, I think it was, Peterson's Abominations. And I refused to do maps like I had just done for the far bigger project that had come before. So I decided, completely without discussing it necessarily with the art director, that I was going to try something new. One of them was, this is just a house where the adventure takes place. And I was wandering around thinking, how the hell can I make a house interesting? It's just another bloody house. And I walked past an estate agent and looked at it and went, I'm going to make one of those. I'm going to make one of those selling house things so I can turn it into a handout that they can actually give out to the players. So it's not just a map for the GM, it's an actual handout. It's something that's lying in the house. They've just bought the house. Excellent. So I went off and I was suddenly inspired, and that was, loosely speaking, almost a random number generator generated by walking down the streets, and the things that were around me giving me ideas for how I could tackle an existing problem in a new way. And that map's online. I'll pop it up in Discord afterwards so you can see it, because it's completely crazy for a Call of Cthulhu map, because it's not dark, it hasn't got tentacles, it just looks like an advert for
but in some ways. But in some ways, that makes it much more creepy. There's something really creepy about a house for sale.
Contrasting.
I thought you were going to say.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say there's something really creepy about estate agents.
Well, there is.
100%.
bringing the mundane into stark contrast with all the horrible gribblies that were about to come. Exactly. And I did that throughout the course of the maps for that book. I was looking for other ways to present things. So one of them was presented as a computer screen offering. The other one was a website. One of them was as I recall, it was a government leaflet that had been handed out with little post-it notes on it saying things like "Stop pissing about" and similar. The whole idea being to try and turn them into not just maps that were conveying information to the GM. They were actual handouts. They were things that were useful in game. They were things that could also tell stories. So by making an advert for a house, that means you knew the person had moved in recently, which is a small detail that was in the text. And I could also mark on that person was disabled for a variety of reasons and it had recently happened. So I dropped a couple of handwritten notes onto "This house will be perfect for you," because it's got a chairlift or whatever. And these were all details that were important to the adventure, because that character was disabled for a reason because of the horrible things that they had been exposed to, because Cthulhu. So telling stories in a slightly different way, again, determined by a random number generator. And in this case, the random number generator being having a walk.
Being life. Yeah, everything's grist to the mill when you've got the right mindset, isn't it?
I do love a handout, as Red Mantis Zaf says. They add so much texture to a game. I think, Mark, you were going to come in. Have you forgotten?
No, I'm still bubbling away. What Andy was saying about exam conditions for being forced to be creative, to come up with, to be inspired, and that's very much a challenge. Certainly, I've found over the years working in the games industry, particularly the video games industry.
Right.
You are in a big studio, expected to be at your desk at work, being imaginative and occasionally brilliant between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. And how do you do that if on a 5 days a week? How do you keep that sort of thing going? So I think anything that any sort of practices that you develop, any shortcuts, any ways to get your subconscious firing on a regular basis is really useful. So things like the randomization stuff, I think is really useful. What I found really handy was actually having half a dozen things on the go at one time, so you could always jump between one to the other. So I'd have a bunch of concepts, a bunch of ideas, some in sort of the rendering stage, some in the quick first early thumbnail stage. And if you ever came up against a imaginative brick wall on one idea, you go, well, I'm going to leave that, let my subconscious think about that for a bit more, and I'm going to come along and do some painting on this bit, and then you can jump back to that bit. So having a bunch of plates spinning simultaneously always kind of gave you that little bit of breathing room that I found you needed when you're in a studio situation where you essentially got a conveyor belt of production line, hammering past you constantly. That was it.
I always like to draw inspiration for characters. I think we were probably playing vampires, so there was always ghouls and new childer, and you'd move to a new city and we would help Andy populate it. And at the time I was working at a hotel in Edinburgh, the Balmoral Hotel, and I was like a maitre d' type hostess person. So every day I had to call every single new person, in fact almost every room, and ask them if they wanted to have dinner in the restaurant, which was, you can imagine, a joy of a job. But because of that, I got the list every day of all of these people's names. They were coming from all over Europe, and I would just write them down and take them away, mix them up. When they would come into the restaurant, I would chat to them about their stories, and you would get such interesting people with such peculiar stories that you would never think to make up yourself. Like a former ballerina whose husband was now a director, and she'd had to give up her career to have children, and I would make up these stories about how sad or happy she was or wasn't. It was a really good way to just get unusual glimpses into other people's lives, including once I tried on Graham's Norton's jacket as a dare in the clothes cupboard.
As you do.
Did it fit?
It did fit, because I was quite slender then, because I was walking all day, miles and miles a day, and he is a surprisingly tiny person.
He is.
It was lovely. It was like black and red and white leather. It was really cool. But he thought that the safe in the room was a microwave and left his fish and chips in there. So I would say that the hotel came off worse than he did.
Whoa! You buried the lead there. What?
I mean, this feels like you need to now go on his show and go in the red chair and then tell that story.
Oh my God, that'd be amazing one.
That'd be brilliant. Clunk. Let's get rid of her fast.
Yeah. There's a British pop culture reference for everybody.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Some of the characters that have probably like bubbled up in Warhammer canon because they were originally mine and made their way in were half the name of guests at the Balmoral Hotel in the 90s. So
interestingly, you should say that a Warhammer author whose name I won't drop because they haven't said this story publicly, but it is definitely true. Like to write in cafes for that reason. So he would sit inside the cafe and he would people watch hard, because as he was writing along, he'd do this and he'd go, "Oh, that's an interesting detail. Let me just crib that into the story I'm writing. Oh, that's an interesting detail too. Oh, really? You're knitting, you say? No, wait a minute. No, Warhammer. No, that's no good." And they would constantly pull from the people around them and write in cafes every single day for that reason. And they were particularly disappointed when their favorite cafe closed, because it was such a rich source of inspiration for not just their Warhammer novels, but all the other novels they were working on as well. But yeah, people watching, a surprising source of inspiration and not creepy at all, honest.
There you go. I've kind of answered that. What's my most unusual source of inspiration? Having to phone people who are grumpy because they're jet lagged and ask them whether they want to reserve a table for two.
I was going to say, I think quite a lot of writers do that. Like Ian Rankin, who obviously lives in Edinburgh. He I know does a lot of kind of work in cafes, in particular in Starbucks often. Because I know at one point where I was in and marking in a Starbucks while he was in and writing, and then he tweeted about being in that Starbucks, and I got that tweet, and then I had to wrestle with, like, do I reply to that tweet? Is it creepy if I let him know that I'm watching him while he sent a tweet? And then in the end I didn't. I just carried on my marking.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Unusual.
Graham?
Well, I think I've answered that. Probably the music of Deep Purple involved in forming a fantasy adventure is pretty weird.
Taking the music of Moulin Rouge and turning that into an adventure. I did that once.
Oh, there you go.
So the musical version, obviously, with Ewan McGregor and Nicole Kidman, and taking the songs in that and turning that into a vampire adventure, a complete unexpected mash, and that was crazy. And then turning that into bits of fictiony pieces afterwards, that was an odd one. To loosely answer that, rather than specifically, I will draw inspiration for whatever is around me. I have found myself grasping for names by just looking across the room at the various book titles. I have found myself looking out windows and seeing things happening out there and going, "Oh, that will do. I can now adapt that and turn that into something else. How do I dial this up to 11?" The obvious inspirations of what we read, what we watch, are clear and are definitely influential. But I'd say probably nowadays my strongest influences are just whatever happens to be around me in conjunction with the problem that I'm currently dealing with. So say it's a crazy map. I'm thinking about that map, walking along, and I see a thing and I'm like, I'll crib that in somehow. Love it. How can I make these two things work in an interesting mash? And that's the same for writing. When I'm walking along, if I'm finding that I've got an issue, for example, as Andy was discussing structural issues earlier, and I'm looking for ways to populate that in a slightly unexpected or more interesting fashion, sitting at home looking at a blank screen is just never useful. Then I will be cribbing from something else, and my inspiration will have run dry, and I'll just be repeating other people's material in slightly different ways, and that's never good for anyone. It's not good for me creatively, and it's not good for the material that's getting created because it feels dry. So that's when I tend to find it's time to go stomping, because the real world out there will provide more of an inspiration than almost anything else.
So here's a question. Speaking of generating random names, etc., there's a rumor that Gazkul Mag Urak Thraka was named after Margaret Thatcher.
I can't
That's
speak
it.
to that directly.
That's interesting. I can't speak to that directly either, but it was.
But there's another character, right, named after Margaret Thatcher.
Oh
yes,
of course.
there's the Empress Margarita,
Marguerite.
who came to power in 1979 AC. Yeah, and if you go back beyond that to Macbeth, the old Warhammer box set, you know, there's the dwarf miner Arca Zargle, named after Arthur Scargill, the head of the Miners' Union at the time. And it was a long established thing in Warhammer. And actually, if you go to Wolfrock first edition, a lot of I've written a few articles about this, a lot of the pictures there by Tony Ackland, especially the character pictures, are based on studio personalities.
Tony Ackland's art right there.
That's right. He had a particular feud with John Blanche, and John featured in the, let me see, he was pictured as the beggar career in an act of petty revenge, and also for the megalomania mental disorder.
Shots fired! Wow,
yeah. And there were a few like that.
Do love it. Yeah, that makes me laugh.
I really wish we had some beefs now so that we could do that. We could write some beefs in our stuff, but we love everyone.
Give it time.
Yeah, it's early days.
Early days.
So does anyone use their dreams as inspiration? So I have remembered my dreams solidly every night since I can remember pretty much the first one I had when I was 3. It was a nightmare about, I'm not going to say because it's a nightmare about a person, but she was dressed as a witch and there was a blue moon. First dream I remember. The next dream I remember, I was flying to my friend's house with magic wings I'd created from my mum's feather collection. So, and ever since then, dreams have been a constant source of inspiration for me. So does anyone else use their dreams?
I have. But in my case, I very rarely remember my dreams. My dreams are something that are fragmented and remembered about once a month at best. But I have woken up a couple of times and gone, well, that was fucking amazeballs. And I was off, and it deserved a swear word because it really was. And I've adapted it directly into most commonly material that I'm creating for my personal campaigns. But when I was working on the Grim RPG from FFG, a lot of that was all about fairy tales, and some of the spells that got dropped into that were completely inspired by my overthinking about all the different things that I could do going to sleep, and then that influencing my dreams clearly, and all manner of craziness coming through my dreams, and me waking up going, that's exactly what I needed, thanks brain, and then applying that into some of the spells that I then wrote for that RPG. So yes, occasionally, but on my side it's pretty rare.
Yeah, I tend not to remember my dreams, and I've never been in a situation where I've had to have a character speak in public with no trousers.
Makes mental note.
I mean, I'm
making that happen.
It's got to now.
I
used to be able to.
Sorry, Mark.
I used to be. I don't tend to remember my dreams. I used to be able to trigger vivid dreams if I ate strong cheese right before bed. But it's too much trouble now, frankly.
now that just gives me heartburn. That's all.
Yeah. Well, that's it now. Yes, as a younger man, yeah, of course, you could eat a big old slab of Danish blue at midnight and it'd be fine. These days, though, no, not so much. I just lie there awake in the cheese sweats. That's no good.
Oh,
I also find
cheese
that
sweats. Now there's a Warhammer disease.
Yeah,
cheese sweats.
I do tend to find my dreams also give me inspiration for like a puzzle that Andy's presented to us in character, and I have visions of him like just sitting next to me, like whispering in my ear these random things as I sleep. That's maybe a bit creepy though.
That's a little too much information.
Yeah, I'm gonna say I don't really remember my dreams like much at all, and I don't know if it's connected because I have aphantasia, which I don't know if I've talked about in the streams before, but I have like virtually no visual imagination at all. I close my eyes, I don't see pictures or things, so I don't know if there's a connection there. But I also have, I know, proper weirdo, right? Although there's more of us than you think. There's a whole Twitter account linking us all up now, but possibly related to that, I used to suffer very badly from insomnia as well. And the way I trained myself to make myself fall asleep is, as I'm trying to fall asleep, I essentially tell stories in my imagination, like narrate little stories. And although I never remember my dreams, sometimes as I'm falling asleep, those little stories that I'm thinking of have then worked their way kind of into something. So, for instance, without giving away too many details, but the prince in our city, his initial germination, is that the word, was from exactly that kind of situation. Was just a little kind of story I was kind of imagining myself. So then when it came to us writing a city and thinking about who was going to be ruling it, and he's changed beyond all recognition from what he initially was, but that was the first sort of germ. So the opposite, I suppose. Instead of waking up remembering something, it was thinking about something as I was falling asleep. So, yeah.
I think as well that's a really interesting starting point to a potential conversation as well, because one of the great things that we have is that almost everything that we've created so far hasn't been created really by any of us. It's this bizarre merging of ideas that starts off with, for example, a very simple point of inspiration, an internal conversation that came out the name Whispering Prince and what it could be. I remember when Andy first was discussing that, when we were nailing down some of the core details way back before we even had a company, and we were discussing what we could do. And where that then moves to as each of us discuss it, and then the words get written down, and then those words get edited, and then those words get played with, and then art comes in, and we look at the art and we go, we need to incorporate that now, and that becomes the new story that's being told. And the layer upon layer upon layer of creative, let's call it genius for everyone else's.
Wow, why not?
Because why not, I say, genius. But the layers of creative input and how that's turned some relatively simple ideas into interesting, complex, fascinating, deep, and sometimes frivolous plot points that are beginning to sow their way through the work. One of the, from my perspective, where I'm coming at the text very near the end, even if I've written large chunks of it, I'm still coming at it near the end and ensuring that all the links are in place for future products, ensuring that we're properly sowing seeds for the things that are coming next. One of the great joys of that is taking everything we've discussed and then sowing little seeds for those things that we've discussed throughout the course of the text. And they can be just simply a little rumor that's sitting in someone's NPC mouth, or they might be the inspiration behind one of the games, little mini games that sit in there. For example, Ship of Fools has got somebody at a door somewhere.
Oh,
is that you?
It is.
That's inspiration calling.
That is inspiration calling at the door. But for example, in Ship of Fools, there's now a dice game and there's a card game, and both of those are not just little mini games that can be played. Both of those are telling stories for what's going to be coming next from future products. So one of them called, well, you'll find out. But yes, I think that's, from my perspective, a great joy, because you get to see all of the sources of inspiration, some of which are just silly offhand comments or a quick comment in Discord where someone's going, I thought this would be awesome. And we're like, yeah, it would. And then weaving all of those into the existing plots as they stand, and looking at the final piece and going, who made this? I mean, who?
The doorbell makes me think that we're in that show Inside Number 9, which is a really good example. It's of a show which takes one concept, the number 9 door, and turns it into like random sources of inspiration again and again and again.
If you haven't seen that show, it's oftentimes brilliant, sometimes a bit hit or miss, but it's really, really good. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But it's quite a good lesson in just taking one plot point and running with it,
spinning a story around them.
Yeah, and like you said, like it can come from anything. So like literally in sort of preparation for this, I'm sort of trying to think about stuff that I could potentially talk about in terms of weird sources of inspiration. And we were like literally watching a documentary earlier today. And it was Dave Grohl's documentary series Cradle to Stage, where him and his mum talked to a bunch of other musicians and their mothers about their lives and stuff. Oh. And so the one today was Geddy Lee from Rush and his mother, and because both his mother and father survived the Holocaust, like they were both in concentration camps, survived the Holocaust, were reunited afterwards, emigrated to Canada, and so that was sort of part of this story. And the previous one had been Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine and Audioslave, and his mother Mary Morello was this like really inspirational figure and kind of activist and stuff. And just thinking about that, then bearing in mind we're writing a city, and one of the things we talked about in our urban stream was the idea of the kind of the depth of the NPCs and relationships. That suddenly made me think about generational relationships as well, and both politically, and then what we could do with that in a fantasy context if we were to use like a longer lived species as well, like dwarves or elves or something like that. And there's nothing fully formed there. I'm not going, right, I'm going to write a character who is Tom Morello and his mother Mary Morello, but rather it's inspired me to think about creating NPCs and relationships with NPCs that might draw inspiration from that. And by the end of it, there'll be no relation at all to that specific story, but it will have been inspired by that. So
on the parents being inspirational, I cannot but say that is the case for me. And I think a couple of quick details will make that clear. Not only was my parents' library filled when I was a kid of science fiction and fantasy, but the studio for a while had a Space Marine helmet that was made by Mum in it at Games Workshop, which was held in the retail department for quite some time. That was a big Dark Angel helmet made way back in the day. She painted all the banners for Warhammers, the Warhammer banner parades at Games Day. She painted a whole bunch of those as well. So would I say I was inspired by my mum? Yeah, absolutely. My mum's the best. And
she makes
my
good
dad,
scenery too.
Yeah, she made tons of good scenery. We played over that scenery. For example, running on a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay side, the Hooded Man Inn, well known for being inside Night of Blood. We had that, Kugelschreiber's house, we had that as well. 3-dimensional versions of it that you could take apart and move miniatures around on the inside and run them out, which meant that at my games club, I must have run that adventure. I don't know. Definitely scores of times. So many times, because we had the models and it was fun. Awesome mums are the best. And I completely agree, Millie, the GM. Awesome mums, the best.
Yeah.
And inspirational. I probably wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for my parents. And some people, it's quite the opposite. They wouldn't be where they are if it wasn't for their parents and standing against them. And doing what they want to do because their parents led them in one direction, they wanted another. And for others, it's because the parents took a very active part of their lives. But in all of our cases, to a degree, I imagine our parents have had an influence.
Well, my mum was delighted when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons because it got me out of the house, for one thing. Also improved my social skills, my numeracy, lots of adding up. So yes, certainly from that point of view. But yeah, supporting parents are really important.
Yeah. Those sound like all the arguments we used to use to sell Warhammer to people in the shop back in the day.
Yeah, right. I remember those arguments. It helps with your math, hand-eye really coordination.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. My parents, particularly my mum, it was inspiration and opposition combined, because my mum was a great storyteller. I remember when I was little, she made up stories, bedtime stories and that. And she wrote a series of books which she typed up on her manual typewriter, children's books for me and my cousins. And
wow.
And yet at the same time, she was bound and determined that I should make my living in commerce somehow, preferably accountancy. So when games came along and looked like they offered me a channel for rebellion and an alternative lifestyle, I kind of, alternative lifestyle is probably not the best choice of words, but you know what I mean.
No, that's inspiring.
No judgment here. No judgment here, Graham.
No, a safe space in the Rookery. Yeah, but so in a way, I was driven towards gaming as a career with more enthusiasm because it was an alternative to accountancy, and I could prove that I can make a living at this. Look, and
the Rookery, an alternative to accountancy.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Write that down.
There's a strap line right there.
Yeah.
Put that on the posters.
Apologies to any accountants who may be listening.
All of my team are chartered accountants, so apologies to them.
Hilarious.
Yeah, one of my great uncles was a certified accountant. We used to laugh about that.
My parents used to do kids' books as well. Blip from Bloop, the alien that came along and spoke to Andy, the child. But never, when I was a kid, I didn't actually properly conflate that with myself because I was stupid and young. And had a little chocolate teddy bear, and it was all very strange. But yeah, we've still got that. They wrote one of those for our kids when we were they were little, and that was nice because my mom illustrated it and sent it over, and illustrated a little picture for the wall, which was lovely. In my case in particular, I found those sort of relationships, and also the relationships around me, have strongly inspired, much as Andy suggested, the characters that I've built in certain settings. I had a friend whom I won't go into any details with, who had a terrible relationship with their parents. And I mean, it was terrible, running away from home and a whole variety of different things. And they became an inspiration for a set of characters in one game. I spoke to them about it first. It wasn't just an uplift without asking. I said, do you mind if I do something like this? Because it's something that's out with. So I had a chat with them about exactly what they went through. And it was fascinating from the perspective of writing a character that I personally would not normally go close to, because I wouldn't be sure quite how to portray it. And that was good. So yeah, family life, an unexpected soap opera of inspiration.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've been talking mostly about story and character so far, and it occurs to me, let's talk about sources of inspiration for setting and mood and tone.
I'm a moody git anyway.
I've already mentioned, my love of old Hammer horror films and how they informed my approach to things. That combined with things like Monty Python. I always have this little Michael Palin voice in my head saying, I guess the witch scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail is the best example of that, sort of bringing things forcibly down to earth. But also folklore, that sort of dreamlike. I think it sort of keys into something in the human psyche because it's a cultural artifact. It's created collectively by everybody in a culture. And so partly it's lazy because I know it works. It pushes buttons. But also it's very pleasing when I can create that sort of almost dreamtime state, the suspension of disbelief, knowing that it's still fantastic sort of thing.
It's one of the things I particularly love about role-playing games, because when you're playing through them, you can pitch yourself into not just a character that's different, but an entire world, an entire situation that is so much more immersive than almost anything else that you can experience. Now, I think the closest probably to it, if we're looking at other forms of media, is probably video games, where you're placed in often the hands of another character, or you're controlling a character, you're making that character's decisions and seeing the world as that character sees it. For more the action role-play games, or the role-playing games are similar. But even then, the sense of freedom that you get from tabletop role-play just doesn't exist. And also the sense to adapt and change and present it to a way that directly speaks to the players that you happen to have. It can't be replicated with ease with a computer game. And in terms of inspiring that, I think rather than saying that I like to look around and get my inspiration from others, I think a large part of my job is to actually be that point of inspiration for other people, to present material that inspires people to create their own stuff within a framework that they might not have originally considered. So in some respects, I like to think that we, as the Rookery, and indeed other creators out there, are as useful as a walk in the park. To go back to our earlier discussion as to one of the best things to get ourselves going, we're as useful as a walk in the park.
So as a walk off a cliff.
There's another strap line.
Yeah, as useful as a walk in the park, the Rookery. But I like to think that what we're doing with a lot of our material is not just saying, look at this absolutely freaking awesome thing, We're saying, look at this and look at how it can be used, and how can that be then adapted to the worlds that you're using? Because obviously, even on the stream, there's going to be a host of different people, all of whom are playing quite different games. And if we created, let's just say, a Gribbly, a nice creature, let's call it the Ghost. We create this Ghost. It's not only going to fit in perfectly to maybe one or maybe two of those individual games out there, but as creators, we want to be able to inspire all of you to, if not necessarily use that Ghost as written, be able to use that Ghost.
Right.
So a lot of our work is not just about being inspired and bringing those inspirations to the people. It's also about finding methods of inspiring you to be able to use all the material that we use, so that when something like Ship of Fools comes out, it then becomes the Spaceship of Fools, or the Train of Fools, or something similar. And I think that's a challenge that all of us are aware of, while simultaneously not necessarily always writing towards or arting towards or whatever. But we're definitely always aware of it. And I know that right at the top level, when I'm looking at the final thing going, does it do everything? Oh my goodness. That's a very real and present concern. Can this be used by everyone? And that in turn means, is this inspiring? I think.
And also the community that we're building should hopefully help people inspire each other. On that note, there was this question very early on in the stream, but the people watching have been answering it quite helpfully and coming up with suggestions. So I didn't bring it
in. Thanks, everyone. You're the best. Was there any good answers? Because I completely missed that. I was too busy warbling.
So the person would like them to play first or second edition Wifrit, but with the mindset of not as a power gamer. Even the new Warhammer system seemed to encourage that. And Righty Stream stuff has said the new edition can give you that impression. Then you get critted into a new week, and that feeling goes away after that. And then there was also a comment that Ship of Fools and Ship of Fools certainly didn't favour power gamers, and I wonder where that comment comes from. Is that because you need to be an all-rounder?
I'll drop a couple of comments on the Warhammer one specifically. It was designed for exactly the point that is brought up there. It is meant to look like you can min-max and you can power game and you can do all those, because that's a fun part of gaming. Focusing in on all those key skills that you want and those key talents that you want is a fun part of gaming for many people. But equally, Warhammer at its very core is not a power gaming game, in that at any moment one crit can come along and wipe you out. But equally, unlike games like D&D, which tend to be total party kills or something similar, it's got its own lives mechanic. So it's quite forgiving. In that it's got fate points that just sit there saying, well, you know, you didn't actually die today, so we can come back and we can learn from the combat that we've just had. Clearly, combat wasn't a good idea. Perhaps we should approach this in a slightly different way. And to conclude on the Ship of Fools point, yes, you're right. It didn't necessarily favour power gamers, at least for that adventure. By any stretch of the imagination, there was always a way around the things that we're doing. And that was something that through the course of the streams that we were offering during the playtest, something that came up more than once, different ways to present adventure material.
Right. And situations, I mean, if you want to prevent power gaming, present adventures where it's either useless or dangerous. So either, social adventures, or adventures like Call of Cthulhu style adventures, where the big nasty is just so powerful that the power gaming approach isn't going to work, and you're forced to be more creative.
Although I will add, though, that power gaming at its core is not a bad thing. For a lot of people, it's part of the fun. Yeah. I'm quite forgiving with these things personally, because it's more about how those characters interact with the world for me. If power gaming means that they're not real characters, then that's an issue. And that they're just walking bits of muscle that hit everything that comes before them. That's not a character. It's not even a power fantasy. But if they've got good characters and they've happened to min-max them to try and get the best out of the rules, I think that's fine. In fact, I personally enjoy that, because it's often a really good stressor of rules as well. So you can look at the rules and say, are they collapsing or are they not? The character for me is much more important than necessarily how it's expressed on the character sheet. And ensuring that what's expressed in the character sheet also matches the character that they're playing.
Yeah,
loosely.
Very true.
I have like a particular like memory. I'll keep this very brief, Lindsay, because I know we're almost out of time. But from our vampire game, and as we've talked about it before, we played this game for decades, centuries of our characters' lives, and there were all manner of things. There were big action set pieces, and there were really tense social things, and there were situations that were memorable because of the stories that were there, or because of the descriptions that Andy gave us, or because of our comically inept dice rolling often. But the single most memorable moment in that entire thing for me was a point relatively near the end where my character and another character were in a place. I won't explain all the detail, but we were in a place, and there was a bad thing there, and one character, the other character, worked out as we were talking about it that it was that his destiny was to destroy this thing and hit it with a sword that he happened to have brought with him. And as he declared that action, I realized that he'd been tricked and that was the opposite. And I didn't have time to tell him that because he'd already declared his action. So my character essentially stepped in the path of that blade to sort of sacrifice himself to stop that happening. And he didn't actually die, he survived just. But the tension around that and the fact that for both of those characters, that was the culmination in a lot of play and a lot of influence in how they viewed the world. And it was an entirely character-driven moment. And I think like everything I have written has been to try and give people the opportunity to have that experience because it was incredible. And I want as many people to have that role-playing experience as I possibly can. You can't force it, but all I can do is engineer as many situations as I can where maybe someone will do an interesting thing or a creative thing or a character-driven thing in a way that furthers the story and makes those memorable moments. So,
and on that note, we have come to the end of our allotted hour.
Thanks, everyone.
And we shall bid you all adieu for another week.
See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.